Are we sitting at tables that we should be flipping? I wanted to do a short video on this, but it looks more like it's going to be a series because there's so much in this question. A good friend of mine posted something on social media that asked this question, and it's a great question, but this is a concept many people don't really understand. Why did Jesus flip the tables? Did he only do it once? Whose tables were they? And lastly, who was he addressing in his speech after this occurred? Let's start with the accounts. Matthew, Mark, and Luke have placed their accounts of Jesus turning the tables undeniably in the Passion Week, the week leading up to the resurrection. John's account holds some different details, along with some overlap, but it's pretty clear that it was intentionally placed at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. That leads many people, myself included, to believe that Jesus did this on two separate occasions. If you want to dive deeper on this, consider this against Jesus' withering of the fig tree and how that supports this position. Let me know in the comments, and I can make a short video on that. So in John's Gospel, we see this. Now the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. And he found in the temple those who sold oxen and sheep and doves, and the money changers doing business. When he had made a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple, with the sheep and the oxen, and poured out the changers' money and overturned the tables. And he said to those who sold doves, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of merchandise." Then his disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house has eaten me up." So the Jews answered and said to him, "What sign do you show to us, since you do these things?" Jesus answered and said to them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." Then the Jews said, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking of the temple of his body. Therefore, when he had risen from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this to them, and they believed the scripture and the word which Jesus had said. Now when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover, during the feast, many believed in his name when they saw the signs which he did. But Jesus did not commit himself to them, because he knew all men, and had no need that anyone should testify of man, for he knew what was in man. That's a lot, I know, but we'll move as quickly as we can, I promise. The first thing to understand is who the money changers were. Their job was to take people's currency and make it something useful to the temple. Sometimes that would be changing for local currency for the temple tax, which was a half shekel for every male above 20 years of age. That was equivalent to a half a day's wages, as is commonly understood. Another thing these money changers were responsible for was allowing people to turn money into animals for the various offerings. The reason they were selling oxen, sheep, and doves was so that people could give them to priests to offer up for various things. At first glance, this doesn't seem like a problem at all. God commanded the sacrifices, after all. He even commanded the temple tax, so what's the deal? There are several core issues with this. Most people get hung up on one of two things, maybe both: the profit made by the money changers and the fact that they were doing it on the temple grounds. While these are valid points, they're symptoms and not causes. What I mean is that they are a result of some larger systemic issue, and that's what I want to get to. First, let's talk about these two implications that we already have in front of us. Let's start with the profit margins. People are right to be mad about this. At my home church, New Discovery Baptist Church in Sutton, West Virginia, we've spent the last 3 months studying through the Old Testament law and had a great conversation around why God made specific commandments about interest on loans. This is close to the point that they're trying to make, but not quite. Why is it an issue that these people are paying a profit margin? Because effectively, the money changers, and ultimately those who handled them, they were receiving part of the sacrifice. We have to remember that this is not just a monetary obligation. They're not paying rent here. They are coming before what they believe to be, and what I believe to be, the God who created the universe, and they're doing one of two things. They're either fulfilling their obligation, or they're serving faithfully. The difference between the two is the difference between compliance and obedience. And that's a whole other conversation that we need to have on this channel someday. So what about the other? Selling inside the temple. That's something that people really get caught up on, and it's led to all sorts of superstitions. There was a time in my life that I wouldn't pay somebody something that I owed them in the lobby of the church I attended because I felt like I was going against the principle that Jesus was upset about in this moment. Was I right? I don't think so. Part of this ties intricately into the profit margin, but there's just a little bit more. The idea of doing business on the grounds of God's temple was totally outside God's design for this temple. If you go all the way back to the design of the tabernacle, you won't see a place for a cash register. You won't see a place for stocks with which to keep animals. Why? Because the Jews had ultimately cheapened this whole process in a significant way. This all boils down to legalism. No surprise coming from me, right? No, not everything wrong with the church is a result of legalism, but legalism diminishes the work of Christ, and I'll show you why. The very nature of the word sacrifice, it implies a personal loss for God's sake. None of this exchanging process was scriptural in its execution. Anyone could take some of their money and buy a sacrifice that held no personal value and thus be right with God in some twisted regard. Was the goal to buy indulgences? Because that's what this looks like. No, that was never the point. If you go all the way back to the beginning, to Genesis, we look at Cain and Abel, you'll see how valuable Abel's sacrifice was to him and to God. Abel had to give the best and trust God to continue to sustain him. Abraham and Isaac paint the same picture. Abraham had waited a whole human lifetime to see God's promise come true, and he had to trust that God could take away what Abraham saw as fulfillment, and that God's promise would still be true. The followers of Jesus who walked beside him had to watch him be crucified and trust that he was still the Messiah for those 3 days until he was resurrected. We today must follow Christ not by sight, but by faith. We don't go to the money changers to buy a dove or a goat anymore, but do we go to church, sit through the services, pay our dues, and expect that that brings us reconciliation? If that's what you're holding on to, you're in grave danger, my friend. If you're sacrificing compliantly and not serving obediently, you're trapped in legalism, and it's time to escape. Have a blessed day.